I'm Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with Eley Williams and Mary Norris discussing Attrib and other stories. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, feel free to use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions in the last portion of the discussion, though if we run short on time, we do apologize. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable the captions, click the CC Live Transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. We do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We are really grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Eley Williams has been a literary sensation ever since this collection of experimental short fiction was published in the UK. Lauded is elegant and exhilarating, Attrib and Other Stories won the James Tait Black Prize, was longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize, and was named a Best Book of the Year by The Guardian. Attrib presents a cast of unforgettable characters standing at the precipice of emotional events: a disastrous breakup, a successful date, an unexpected arrival, and finding it fiendishly impossible to express themselves. With intimate, irreverent, and playful prose, Eley Williams rejoices in both the possibilities and limitations of language, as well as the very human need to be known and understood, despite our own best efforts. Williams will be in conversation with Mary Norris, who joined the editorial staff of The New Yorker in 1978 and has been a copy editor and proofreader there for more than 30 years. She is the author of 2 books, Between You and Me and Greek to Me. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Eley Williams and Mary Norris. Thank you both.
Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here. And so nice to meet you, Eley. I can't say exactly in person, but you know, in virtual, at least we get to talk in real time. So I'd like to start by asking a little about your publishing history. Attrib is in the States, it's your second book, but I think it must have been your first to be published in the UK?
Yeah, that's right. So it was published by Influx Press initially in the UK, which is a small independent press based in London, run by 2 guys basically out of their garage. And I was lucky enough to, I was part of a creative writing master's and was writing short fiction there. And one of my peers on that group, in that cohort, ran an open mic night, which lots of poets used to read their work at. And then unfortunately for them, a prose writer came along and everyone kind of rolled their eyes and kind of settled in their seats. And I bored them to death with some of my short fiction. But luckily for me, in the audience, one of those publishers was sitting and was rapt enough to ask whether I'd thought about bringing out a full manuscript, a full collection. And we started talking and trading stories. So yes, in the UK, certainly it was my first publication, followed by my novel, while in the US, the novel rose to the fore and the short fiction has scurried behind. But it's
like received wisdom in publishing that your second book doesn't get the attention that your first book gets, and you have managed to finesse that. I think it's really a hat trick. It's a good thing. But I was because the language is so rich and and you work via association a lot in your prose. I had a suspicion you wrote poetry. Is this the case?
You suppose correctly. I do dabble in those dark arts. Maybe that open mic night got to me in ways that I shouldn't admit. But no, I've written a chapbook of poetry that's been published and underread. Let's put it that way. I've always enjoyed language and the machinations of language. By enjoyed, I mean I've always sought refuge in it rather than plot. So I think that for me, poetry was a way of thinking through ideas with images, with rhythm, with lilt and precision in a way that didn't demand characterization that didn't demand beginning, middles, and ends in quite the same way. So I certainly found myself writing poetry and then trying to see what shape that language could really be applied to the idea of plot and to structure. And I think some of my favorite writer is Ali Smith, who's a Scottish writer based in the UK. And for me, it is a sentence by sentence basis by which language is just held as this very tender, very kind of fragile and delicate thing. And for me, I care about sentences in a way that I think poets like to say that they care about sentences. But my heart really is with characters and with the way in the ways we can kind of ventriloquize and have thought experiments with structure and with plot. So there I am.
Notice that there is among all the playfulness with language, it always serves a greater purpose. It weaves back into a plot and characterization somehow. But what I find delightful is that your prose has the sensibility, I think, of a poet behind it. I think of, for instance, when a poet turns her hand to prose, the results can be just really luscious in that it's really wonderful to read on a sentence to sentence basis. I think of James Merrill, whose book A Different Person is so wonderful, and also Patricia Lockwood, whose memoir, I don't know if you're familiar with Priest Daddy, but she was a poet. And it's as if, there's a surprise at every turn. So, when you turn the page, you think, did I skip a page? Because there's something unexpected showing up at that top left where you think you maybe are trying to guess what comes next.
I mean, I should say that a lot of the plots and characters in my short fiction and in the novel, they are very uneasy with language. They are unsure that they're communicating properly or well or convincingly. So in a way, maybe I'm kind of doing a bit of a performance of saying, well, I don't really know what a sentence could do or what it might be up to, and then projecting that into the characters and into the plot.
It works. Whatever it is, it works.
Yeah. I'll keep doing it, unfortunately, for everyone else.
I wanted to ask you in particular about the title. I was pronouncing it Attrib, as if it rhymed with AFib, the heart palpitations. And I'm very curious about the title because, I saw from your epigram that Attrib, you quote Samuel Johnson on to attribute, I believe, in the epigram. But I suspected that there was a reference to the grammatical term to the dictionary term attributive, and the grammar term, which means, what does it mean? It's a way of modifying a noun without a linking verb. It's a way of making a noun into an adjective that modifies a noun without the linking verb. And I have said many times in my copy editing career to explain why you don't need necessarily a possessive apostrophe in farmer's market. I just say it's attributive, and people are, oh, okay. But I honestly don't know what it means in this instance. I've read the story a couple times, and would it be giving anything away if you could shed some light first on the title of the story, which is about a Foley editor, sound effects, and secondly on the reason for using it as the title for the whole collection?
I think for exactly that reason of being difficult to pin down, the fact that rather than having attribute or attributive or anything that would be easily defined, I wanted to put the reader, and I wanted to realize myself, that I was asking for clarity when actually a lot of the stories and a lot of the feeling of the stories is about a lack of clarity, a lack of certainty. and attributing certain understandings or positions or stances according to intuition or a sense. So for me, I wanted all of those, greedily, I wanted all of those possibilities for the title to be attributed to the stories. In the story Attrib itself, which was actually the one of the last stories that was written, the UK editors quite early on in the publishing process asked what I would like as a title, and I said Attrib and Other Stories, and then realized 6 months later I should probably write a short story called Attrib so that I could somehow deserve that title. And the US editors very kindly went with that title for this edition.
That was kind of unexpected.
Yes,
well,
yeah.
I fell for this collection with the first story, The Alphabet, where you have this aphasia. There's an instance of aphasia, and the character telling the story has a story for every letter of the alphabet, and it seems to flow so easily. There's no strain, and I got the impression right away that there was a lot more where this came from. So I read the collection with great pleasure. One of the, I think it's important people know it's funny, right? It's always good to know that what you're about to read is very funny. In this story, A Light at the Next, and the reader can supply the end of this next station or stop, where the character is on a crowded train, carriage on the tube, as you say. We would say a car on the train, and everybody loves the expression "mind the gap." But there's, right away there's a sentence, whiskey spelt with an E or without, which is the kind of thing word people, copy editors adore. And there's this wonderful description. There's somebody standing too close to the character, and the character puts a finger on his forehead, just don't get too close sort of gesture. But then she describes him, my favorite line, and that is that he has a tie like a botched tracheotomy. that broke me up. Anyway, I saw that this was all also in service to a romantic life, this whole story on the train. But this one also has snippets of verse in it, doesn't it?
Yes, I kind of wanted with that story, and it feels very weird now to think of setting a story on a tube carriage on the Underground in London. And I live in London, I haven't been on the Underground for such a long time because of COVID, because of restrictions. The idea of the crush of bodies and the proximity that commuters have. Londoners are famous for being quite unfriendly is the idea. So we're all very close together and none of us are looking at one another. We're all kind of breathing in these little kind of capsulated ways, not acknowledging anyone else. And reading that story again now, I think I would be struck by the idea of the importance of proximity. Now that would probably read as quite a threatening story and weird that someone would be close enough to reach and touch, and quite tender maybe in a new way between the narrator and this person that they're touching, rather than this moment of tension and friction, perhaps. But for me, this story is about, mind the gap. It's about these lacunas that open up and where we're unable to communicate and necessarily stake our claims or state our claims in the way that we would like. And I wanted to kind of think through how relationships and unsteadiness might be realized in a moment where a character is trying to be brave or realizes that they seem like they could come across as brave. And how do you deal with that?
Well, it seemed to me that her life or at least her romantic life, just flashed before her eyes in however long that interval was with the finger on the forehead.
Right. And I think maybe, sorry, speaking over you, I think maybe for that reason, the verse form has that, it makes the page maybe a slightly more unsteady place. You're no longer within the margins or the traditional format of prose that you'd expect in a short story. maybe it's gimmicky, but that there's that shift and momentum that comes perhaps with verse lines where you rely on enjambment to understand the meaning maybe at its fullest, or you pivot the kind of rhythm of the sentence slightly differently if you see that your eye line is being moved in a way that isn't just straight across the page. So I think that's why in that story I went a little for versification or prosody within prose. Yeah.
It's a little like trying to keep your balance on a moving train.
Right, right.
Another story I really liked was Concision. This one, that's I don't think I'm giving away a lot, but character on the phone has been hung up on and is staring at the dots and of the receiver. It's got to be an old-fashioned telephone, right? Not a cell phone to work like this. But it struck me, that one in particular, there is so much use of graphic symbols, punctuation to describe these dots, and it's just so rich. I'm thinking of dots and circles. What are some of the images here? I'm just going to read quickly. In isolation, one of the holes in the phone's plastic looks like a full stop. An exclamation mark is a full stop with a cockatoo's crest. Full stops, 3 full stops. Had you been waiting for me to finish your sentence and to join the dots? And a little further down, there's a reference to the black hole of the dots. And I was trying, there's a lot of this. You make remarks about parentheses, a sentence, there's a feeling of unease as if somewhere a parentheses has lost its closing parentheses. I don't have that exactly word for word. So well, obviously you grew up reading and have a relationship with these marks on the page that you're using to describe things in the real world that's not in a book. You're using a book's mechanics to describe things in the world.
Yeah, I think that certainly in that story, and actually in all of them, the notion of text existing as a visual form, but not necessarily something to be read, something that is communicable through words and an understanding of language. But what is it to look at a word and to see it as architecture, or to see it as choreography, or to see it as a darkening or a lightening? And I think that in the same way that many of the narrators in the stories, I wanted them to feel often tentative rather than confident, or to express themselves poorly rather than express themselves well. I similarly wanted them to suddenly not really trust what a page is, or in that example in Concision, not trust that a phone is there so that they can use it like a tool. They can now talk to the person they want to, or they can not talk to, but rather it's a series of holes in some plastic, and they're having to confront this, I suppose, uncanny, this weirdness that is to be confronted or is to be dealt with, rather than that they are able to feel empowered in their own world. Everything that should be familiar is unfamiliar suddenly to them, and that includes language. And often they see strangeness in terms of language and punctuation and grammar. So I think that for me, I return to this notion of those tools that we have, that you are a master of how to use rhetoric, punctuation, the rules well, and how to break those rules so that we have a sense of stylishness or sophistication or ambition, and suddenly see those as rigidities, things that have made kind of define whether we're feeling certain or uncertain. And that, yes, marks on a page suddenly become esoteric rather than something communicable. That's something that I think is recurrent in the collection, and something that I wanted to maybe
Yes,
be
it
playful
certainly
with.
is. I mean, even all kinds of things about print. There's a reference to let's see, our days were glossy and embossed. So, printed invitation, that kind of thing. It's just so many references to things that come from graphics. But I think we should talk a little about your story, your wonderful story, Synesthete Would Like to Meet, because there, the associations and the ways words depart from being words and turn into something else is really, that really is the main subject of that story, I think. And maybe we could begin, if you wouldn't mind reading a few pages from the beginning of Synesthete.
Sure. Let me find a copy. I've put it online so that I could make this as seamless as possible. And then obviously in narrating how seamless it is, I cause ructions. But I'll just read the first couple of pages from Synesthete Would Like to Meet. When I was 8, my sister dropped a copy of the Yellow Pages on my head. I was too busy retrieving my tooth from beneath the radiator to notice any immediate change, but the next day I found that reading the letter B caused a green light to flare directly behind my eyes. My mother explained that I must have been staring too long at the magnetic letters on our refrigerator and was associating their shapes with the corresponding color of the plastic. This could not explain why an ampersand was suddenly a guttering black for me, however, nor why asterisks had become accompanied by a 4-second howl. Neurological synesthesia is an unwieldy phrase to sprinkle into conversation, so I prefer to describe it this way. The part of one's brain concerned with processing sensory information should be like a highly efficient switchboard. Mine is set up as if someone had swapped the wires around, took a mallet to the bodywork, and went to town with a soldering iron and a big jug of water. Apparently, I'm a very rare case, featured in so many medical encyclopedias with labeled photos and everything that I've had to hire a publicity agent. Get me. I have a doctor of my very own who's paid by a multinational pharmacy to investigate my case and observe how I cope with it. He tells me that a number of people experience similar synesthetic aspects. They associate colors with days of the week, for example, or endure specific tastes when they hear certain sounds. My condition, however, is complete. Dawn's light through my curtains stink. My first cup of tea is an orchestra tuning up, and the sound of birdsong outside my window tastes of rose water, and it is scalding. This reaction to birdsong perhaps best demonstrates the way in which my condition is not at all logical. In chorus, the birds taste of rosewater, but individually, the pigeons' coos are a soda-siphoned stream. The starling's taste of double mint chewing gum and blue tits warble comes weirdly with the smell and bobbly feel of pork crackling. The number 3 is orange for me, while 10 smells of buttered bread, but add them together, and rather than a buttery citric compaction of the two, seeing 13 provides a sensation of snakeskin drawn across my upper lip. Glancing at your number penciled onto this napkin, I read a line of digits that are gawky and spavined, slightly flushed and buzzing like clarinets. I'll stop there for now.
That's perfect. Thank you. Are you a synesthete? Seems to me you would have to be able to write this.
No, I'm not. I'm a complete synesthetic imposter. I think I think lots of people, if you did a survey of everyone here and said what color is Monday, I think most people would be able to come up with a color quite quickly, or they'd know what color Monday wasn't. But it wouldn't have that immediacy. It wouldn't have necessarily, if they asked that tomorrow, Monday would necessarily be the same color. So I think I'd put myself in that bracket, in that I have synesthetic sympathies, but no, I do not have that condition myself.
Well, I saw that one critic compared you must have been delighted, with both Dickens and Nabokov. And it was when I read this story that I saw where the Nabokov came from. I thought it was, the story goes on, the premise, you say there's a doctor assigned to you, and it is so funny that a synesthete should have a shrink. And I love it when he takes the character to the movies and can't resist while taking notes also buying a big tub of popcorn. This sounds like a very unprofessional analyst, actually. But whoops, there goes my notes in the wind. I wanted to pursue this idea. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the critics. The thing that I will keep coming back to all the time is the delightful, to me, use of the mechanics of reading and print and words to use things in the real world where we usually think it's the other way around, right? That it's just remarkable that you have such a, it's almost like you read viscerally, like there's something in language that is physiological in your prose. But I have often thought, we're not allowed as authors, it's not very professional to respond to critics, right? If you don't like something that a critic says, the best thing for you to do is just to keep it to yourself. But we have an opportunity here, if we want to respond, or if you want to talk about what the critical response was. It sounds like it's been mostly great.
I think I've been very lucky, and I certainly with Attrib, because it was my first book. I don't think it's humility saying that people were nice. I think they were like, "Who's this fresh-faced little fool? How well has she done?" I think often anything where the subject is language often is read in terms of pretension and in terms of who is this person to attempt to destabilize language, and are they trying to be Nabokov? Are they trying to be Dickens? And that notions of precaution and pretension often come alongside playfulness with language. And because a lot of the characters, as I say, are uncertain and don't really like themselves, I think sometimes, maybe quite rightly, some negativity or some negative reviews of the stories would be that the note that is being struck is of trying to use lots of words, trying to be clever with language, clever with language, and then falling short of that. And I'm not going to say they're wrong. It's interesting that you say about, we all read the bad reviews and good reviews when you kind of remember the poor ones. There are certain lines from Goodreads readers that I will forever, whenever I grate a carrot, I will just mutter them under my breath and get that aggression out. But I tend to think that every read of a story or of a novel is correct for that reader, so they're quite right to find faults. But I'm thrilled with the reception that the book had. I'm glad that people are reading it, and I find that recently, I don't know if you found this over lockdown, I've really wanted to be reading more, but have found it very difficult to keep my attention with fiction. So I have been returning to poetry, and just the idea of, I mean, maybe this sounds a bit whimsical, but the idea of anyone having read enough to write any kind of review, I'm just thrilled that anyone's been sitting down with the book. And especially for a book that is about communication and tenderness, and often about kindness. It's important to me that that Cara, my editor at Anchor, gave this book its time now. I'm very proud of it, and thrilled at the idea of anyone reading it. Really,
it is would be a great book to read on the subway,
Yeah.
Because it is in small sections, so you could get from one, half of your commute. if we were commuting, but we're not commuting. So
Right.
I've
Right.
found actually that because I have not been on an airplane in more than a year, I don't read long books. Because I look forward to taking a big fat book on an airplane with me. Well, I just wanted to share that a friend of mine has this theory about book reviews that they have what he calls about 2/3 to 4/5 of the way through the review, there'll be what he calls the bird shit paragraph. I mean, they can just be effusive in praise, but then they have to find one thing to say something bad about. And of course, that's what sticks in your mind.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'm now going to forget which number it is, but there's a famous French, I think there's a literary prize, and it's given to the best. It's something like number 219, page 219. And every book, they'll just read that page. And if that passes the test, if by 219 the pace hasn't flagged or it's got to a boring bit of the narrative, and a prize will be given for the best page number 219, which
Well,
does make me wonder how much effort you put into that page, and the rest of it is dross, but just 219 shining, gleaming.
Well, another friend of mine has, if he wants to judge whether a book is any good or not, opens it at random and reads a page, and if that page is good, it's a good book. And so every page, I guess, basically has to be good. So I'm attracted to any book that has a literary kind of title. The Grammarians, Kathleen Shine's book, The Grammarians, of course, was like a natural for me. So the Liar's Dictionary would be something I would pick up. But speaking of dictionaries, it seems you have quite a strong relationship with dictionaries. Did you grow up with, and did you ever think of being a lexicographer?
Oh gosh, yes, I did. And in fact, my wife for a short time worked at the Oxford English Dictionary as I think in a kind of intern role. And she had to, at one point, she had to take photographs of balconies because they were going to change the definition of what a balcony was. And she had to find proof that they hadn't shifted so much since the original. No, I think I would have loved to have been a lexicographer. I think a problem there would have been that I get quite kind of hyper focused about words, but then forget where I started. So I went to the archives at the Oxford English Dictionary and with a kind of fictional parallel in the Liar's Dictionary, my novel, at the beginning of the dictionary and how it was made, there would be these little index cards with or small pieces of scraps of paper often where you would have the word that was going to go into the dictionary and its definition and the source for where it was found in literature. And I remember, for whatever reason, looking up the word rat in the dictionary in the archives. And the word rat was not on an index card. It was on this strange little piece of paper. If you turned the paper over, it was a check from the mid 19th century, so with this beautiful copperplate handwriting, that was made out to a rowing club. And I was like, what's going on here? And it was a rowing club that was set up by Frederick Furnivall, who's this 19th century, was on the editorial team for the original Oxford English Dictionary, amongst many other things. And he was the inspiration for Ratty in Wind in the Willows, who of course has a rowing boat. So this connection suddenly in my hand, this physical thing, this artifact in my hand that connected rats with Furnivall, with in my head to Wind in the Willows Ratty, just this 3-letter word suddenly sending me off in all these different directions. I kind of felt kind of flummoxed by language, rather than incisive, rather than clear and fulsome. So I would be a terrible lexicographer because I just sit there kind of being bowled over every so often and not communicating well at all. But no, I would have been delighted and been a very poor lexicographer, I think.
Well, since you brought up the subject, tell us about the giant rat of Sumatra.
Oh dear. That is my Twitter handle that I've had for too long. And that's based, those of you who are fans of 19th century London and of Sherlock Holmes in particular, the giant rat of Sumatra is one of the fixations that is hinted at in one of the original Conan Doyle stories. And John Watson, the narrator, kind of leans in and says, like, sorry, what's the giant rat of Sumatra? And Sherlock Holmes, the character, says, like, oh, that is a story for which we do not have time. I've now forgotten the quotation, which is terrible. But this idea of this story that does exist in the Holmes universe, but that we never get the full story. I suppose it's really about archives and about kind of tantalizing absurd villains, but that's where that name comes from. And I like the idea of the elusive and the not quite explained, that might nevertheless be part of a canon.
And I keep trying to ask you to explain these things.
And I
guess I have
no answer.
another kind of mind that wants, the steel trap kind of mind.
No, quite right.
I saw that for your book event for the Liar's Dictionary, you had a 12-hour reading from dictionaries.
Yeah.
How did that
what
go?
This reveals is my empty social calendar, I think. Yes. I was reading from A to, I think I got to, I'd have to check. It was just in the B's. Yeah, I did a 12-hour reading of, actually, I kind of skipped in between dictionaries, so it wasn't quite what I had planned, but using Chambers Dictionary. And the idea was that if anyone wanted to, they could guess the word that they thought I'd reach in the dictionary after 12 hours. And the closest word that was guessed, they would win a copy of the novel. And very sweetly, friends and strangers guessed that I'd kind of get surely to the T's or to the S's, and now I got to B. So those that had very little faith in my ability to speak very quickly were rewarded. But no, it was fun. It was fun getting into the kind of the undergrowth of the dictionary and reading it as if it was a conventional book that you could read one page after another. The kind of absurdity of dictionaries having page numbers. I encourage you to do the same now.
Do you know the Ammon Shea book, Reading the OED?
Yes, that's a great book.
Somebody got away with that one. Wow. I'm always impressed when people can pull off something like that. So the word drunk comes up a lot in the reviews of your work. And it is very rich in vocabulary. The only word I had to look up, most of them I could tell by their context, the words that I didn't know. I'm not even sure how to pronounce this, was bothy.
Ooh, how is it spelled?
Bothy, B-O-T-H-Y. I know what it means now because I looked it up. It sounds like an Airbnb or a bed and breakfast was made.
Yeah. I think I pronounce it a bothy, but it's a Scottish word, a Scots word, and I could be saying that completely incorrectly. It's one of those words I think I've only seen written down, and then when I use it in conversation, I then second guess myself. No, it's a fun word, kind of a nice encapsulated word.
It was very fun, and that's a great story too. This one where people all gather around a whale that's come up on the beach. Another story, I think the one that you appropriately called Spin is the one where the words and the word play is most woven into the plot of the spider on the ceiling while you're meditating. I'm sorry, I keep saying you, when of course I mean the character. But that
now I reveal.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the point of view. In Attrib, a lot of the time you use the second person plural narrative. Can you comment on that? Why it suits you?
See what you did there. I think for me, it shortens that, I don't know, epistemic distance between the reader and the writer. It brings the reader in as a character. potentially, but also provides this moment where I'm saying, I'm addressing this to a person, but you don't quite get access to who that is. So in a way, it's both gesturing towards the reader, but saying, no, I'm keeping something back as a narrator.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to see everything that I've seen, and you don't get to understand what I am trying to get across. And I find the second person quite alluring for that reason, quite beguiling. And I think it also introduces intrigue. I think it kind of maybe in a funny way puts the reader in pursuit of trying to elicit, am I going to find out who this is? Am I going to be able to define what a you could be? Or am I going to have to interpolate or step into this you and have to answer for this in some way? Mm-hmm. So I guess it comes down to unsteadiness. I guess it comes down to uncertainty, but I found it quite a useful way of introducing a tension or complementing a tension and a frisson that's there. And for that reason, I think maybe it meant that for the stories where I am using the third person, such as Spines, the story with the hedgehog, it felt more that as an author, I was kind of in the position more as a director, almost. Like I felt able to say, okay, then I need to get the view of what the character looked like from above, or I need to have this sense of, okay, now we can concentrate on her hands. While with the second person, at least for me, it felt that it was a bit more about impressions, and it was a bit more about potential proximities, rather than necessarily a kind of scene setting that might be a bit more direct. But maybe I'd feel differently about that now. I'm not sure.
Well, I just noticed, normally I find it's hard to pull off. I find it sometimes off-putting, but yours is kind of epistolary. You know, they're not in the form of a letter, but it's definitely an address to a specific person. And because the undertow of so many of the stories is desire, I think it really is effective in part because it creates that desire in the reader too, because the reader is carried along by the narrator and wants to find out who this other person is too, and doesn't get to a lot of the time, I guess. Well, we have talked for about 45 minutes, and now I see there are a couple of questions. I'm going to ask my own question first, though, which a friend of mine, now that I've finished with the giant rat of Sumatra, a friend of mine who has a bookstore in Sag Harbor, the wonderful Canio's bookstore, is a big fan of yours and hand sells your books to people. And she wanted to know if usage, the rather loose usage of informal language on the internet, if your precision about punctuation and things and focus on that is kind of a reaction to digital phenomena?
That's a really good question. And may I say, your friend seems like a really attractive and thoughtful person. Selling this book. Yeah. Is it a reaction to it? I think, I mean, it must be a reaction in some way, either positive or negative, or combative or kind of assiduous. I think precision requires a slowing down and a certainty. And I think a lot of the way in which I communicate online often is done very spontaneously. So I rely on autocorrect. I rely on either the person to whom I'm speaking or the platform that I'm using to all be kind of sharing the same register. So they'll know if I'm making a joke, or they'll know if I'm expressing something as a manifesto or as a commentary or something like that. And that I think when writing, the difference for me when writing fiction is that suddenly I don't have that sense of who the reader is. I don't have that false notion of the interlocutor and trusting that I know what buttons I'll press of theirs or how it will be received. And so being precise about imprecision, I think, is important to my fiction. That my characters are also smitten with the idea of saying anything well, and then horrified at the idea that they will never be able to know what the other person makes of them through communication. I don't know if that's a good answer for you and for your friend, but I think that certainly a lot of the characters in these stories are not texting or finding it easy to make a phone call. They're caught in this moment between communication and communication. And I think that maybe I've recognized that in my own use of communicating online.
We have one question. No, that was great. One question which I also wanted to ask, who are the writers that have inspired you?
I mean, I mentioned Ali Smith at the top of this. I am very inspired by her and the way in which she exhibits and writes about tenderness and queer lives without schmaltz, without it being a kind of inhuman kind of puff. And I really have admired her work for a long time, and I am inspired by her writing. I also very much currently enjoy the work of Isabel Weidner, who writes in the UK. They write very differently to me, and very urban, weird fiction. They have a new book out in the UK this month, I think, which is called Sterling Carat Gold, and they inspire me. And I mean, Nabokov has been mentioned. I you know, it's nuts that his name would be mentioned in a review of my book. I think that's extraordinary, and I take it as a huge compliment. I also think it's, you know, he's basically a weather system. He is fretted golden fire. And I read a lot of his work when I was growing up, and this idea of care about language and the curation of language being part of storytelling, I find inspirational, and I find I return to his work often. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another question, I was curious about this too. If there were stories that didn't make it into the book, I kind of want to know too how long it took to get together the stories for the book.
Well, actually, there is a story that's in the UK edition that's not in the US one, for various reasons to do with copyright. And in a way, I'm glad, because it involves, if I was to do a reading of it, it involves singing, and none of you have to deal with that. I'm pretty sure over Zoom our screens would shatter if I attempted anything like that. In terms of how long did it take for the stories, or over how many years did it take for the stories to come to fruition and be collected? As I mentioned before, Attrib, which the title story was the last one that was written. That was literally written 3 weeks before publication in the UK, so that was quite fresh. The oldest one, I think, was written at the beginning of my master's, so was about 8 years old. So it does feel a little bit like an anthology from my draft folder. Certainly they weren't all written in one kind of very creative, charged summer. But yeah, it feels like very different moments of my writing life feature in the stories. So it was, yeah, a kind of hopefully a best hits, or at least hits.
Are there, somebody asks if you've said, somebody says that she'd heard or he'd heard or they heard that you have a collection of experimental short fiction. Is that different from some?
Let me think. I think that, I mean, in many ways, these were all experiments, so it would all be in there. I have written, there's one in this collection that I'd say probably was written to be experimental writing, and the kind of genesis for it was reacting to one of the elections that happened in Britain, where, I don't know, we've had a series of elections, general elections, where the outcomes have been pretty depressing and pretty absurd for various reasons. And I wanted to write about absurdity in an absurd way and involving nonsense. So that was very much written kind of on commission to be an experiment in that way. I've also, in fact, during lockdown, with sales of it all going towards supporting independent bookshops in the UK through it's kind of a guild and a charity that's there, asked people to send in suggestions of titles and then auction those titles, and I would write a story based on the title that was suggested. So that was again very much an experiment in writing towards justifying a certain title that someone had suggested, and that was done last summer, and that will be coming out in the UK. I think it was meant to come out in May, but I think it was delayed for various COVID-related reasons.
The ultimate writer's prompt, huh? To take this title.
Yeah, right.
Now, I understand you teach. Do you teach writing?
Yeah, so I teach creative writing at Royal Holloway, University of London. So it's mostly on the master's course, it's a postgraduate course. In fact, it's where I did my master's. So I'm very much stuck in a kind of circuit there, don't really move around much. And I will be teaching short fiction there to undergraduates as well next year.
What form does the class take? Is it a workshop, or do you read example stories?
Good question. It's split between workshops of about not more than 13 students for fiction. And then we also do 2 different papers that are supplementary discourses. So looking at how other writers have approached, you know, how do you talk about place? How do you talk about personhood? How do you talk about, how do you express dialogue? And reading as a writer. So breaking down the relationship between how we absorb from text and how we express having absorbed. And, you know, I should have said in terms of who inspires me, my students just, luckily for me, are extraordinary. And it reminds me why we seek out new things and new voices in new ways. It's energizing. It genuinely is very energizing to teach. And I'm very lucky.
That's great. Well, the last question is the inevitable. What are you working on now?
Gosh.
Writer myself, I hate that question, but I'm asking.
Oh, well, I should put it towards you. What are you writing? What are you writing at the moment?
Oh, no, you're not switching that.
What am I writing at the moment? I have been looking more at more short fiction. So whenever I've got a commission at the moment from the BBC to write a short story cycle. So a series of, I should know this better. If my agent is watching this, look away now, Lucy. It's 10 short stories that all have to have an overarching theme or narrative. And that is going to be about chess. So that's currently what's on the docket for me.
And if it's the BBC, does that mean it will be filmed in some form?
So it'll be for Radio 4, BBC Radio 4. So it will be broadcast with a cast of voices. So I'm, you know, that's a dream come true, and it's an exciting prospect, but still very much in the draft form. So it's not that I'm not giving much away, it's that I don't know what I could give away.
Well, I think that I've really enjoyed finding out about your process, and I think we have to turn it back over to our host now.
Yeah, and we do actually have a surprise bonus question here from Politics in Prose. We always love to ask our authors and moderators, in addition to what you're working on right now, besides this wonderful book of short stories, what are you currently reading or would like to suggest to our audience? It can be fiction, nonfiction, poetry, prose, anything come to mind that's on your bedside table?
Oh, what is on my bedside table? I'm very much looking forward to, there's a collection of poetry by a poet called Andrew Macmillan, who's based in the UK. His new book is called Pandemonium, and it's a kind of searing and tender work of poetry. That's currently what's on my bedside table. What are you reading, Mary?
I want to read the one I'm saving for the next plane trip is George Saunders' book about Russian writers, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. I'm really looking forward to reading that. He's a wonderful writer and I would read him on any subject. So although Russian writers, except I do love Nabokov, are not, it's not a field of study generally for me. I know this will be about writing and I'm eager to read that.
Thank you both so much for those suggestions. It's really been a lovely conversation and so literary in nature for our audience on this Sunday. Our thanks from Politics in Prose to Eley Williams, Mary Norris, and of course our audience out there for tuning in and chiming in with those thoughtful questions. Your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this incredible programming, and we wouldn't be able to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So go ahead and follow the link in the chat to purchase Attrib and other stories, or just head on over to politics-prose.com. And while you're there, you can check out our events calendar for everything else coming up in June and beyond. And from our shelves to yours, we hope you're out there staying safe, staying strong, staying connected, and of course, staying well-read. And we will see you next time. Thanks again, Eley and Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, Eley.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for those questions.